Have you ever looked at a Pokemon, one that's introduced later in the series, and thought, what if this thing was in Generation 1? How differently would it have played if it was in the past? Because I always think about what would happen if my favorite Pokemon, Mimikyu, was in Generation 1. How would it have performed if it was a Gen 1 Pokemon, and how long would it take until this theoretical Gen 1 Mimikyu became the Mimikyu we all know and love today? This is what I'm considering. The differences in Mimikyu's stats, its ability, its typing throughout the ages, how its move pool would have looked when it was more limited in the older gens, what Ghost Specialists would have used it, and where it would have been found in regions other than Alola and Galar. This is to discuss what Mimikyu would have looked like if it was in a game before Generation 7. Maybe for a fan game that's the same as the originals, just with the addition of Mimikyu. First, Mimikyu's stats. Because this is Gen 1, not only is there no physical special split, but also the special stat works very much differently from how it does now. To quickly explain, back in Gen 1, the special attack stat and the special defense stat were one stat. This meant that Pokemon with high special attack like Alakazam would also have high special defense. So these Pokemon could do a lot of damage and in turn tank special attacks very well. So how would a Gen 1 Mimikyu's special stat look like? As of now, Mimikyu has a special attack stat of 50 and a special defense stat of 105. Even though it would be fun to see a Gen 1 Mimikyu have a high special attack stat, I think that it having the 50 for its special stat would make more sense. Even though the special stat worked for both offense and defense, I feel that the special stat that Pokemon were given were made with their offensive capabilities in mind. In Gen 2, when the special stat was split into special attack and special defense, most special stats were converted into special attack and then the Pokemon was given a different stat for their special defense. So with that said, this means that our Gen 1 Mimikyu stats are 55 for HP, 90 for attack, 80 for defense, 50 for special, and 96 for speed. I think that these stats would have made Mimikyu a decent threat. It has a pretty good speed stat, which in Gen 1 would have also given it a good critical hit chance, since in Gen 1, critical hit chance was based on a Pokemon's speed stat. And since Ghost type was a physical stat, meaning that all Ghost type moves use the Pokemon's attack stat, Mimikyu would have been able to use its attack stat to the fullest. Well, that is, if it would have had a Ghost type move in Gen 1. So, in Gen 1, there were only 3 Ghost type moves. Those being Lick, Confuse Ray, and Nightshade. None of which Mimikyu can learn. Yeah, Mimikyu would have been Ghost type Scyther. A Pokemon with good stats, but no stab moves. And you couple that with the fact that Mimikyu would not have had an ability and would have been a pure Ghost type, then the Gen 1 Mimikyu would have been one of those Pokemon that you only really used if you liked it. At least we could have given Mimikyu to Agatha. You know, give her more Ghost types so that she's practically not a Poison type specialist. Now finally, before we go off onto how Mimikyu would have changed in Gen 2, let's decide where in the Kanto region Mimikyu could have been found in. One obvious spot would be in Lavender Town, alongside Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. This is one option. Another place that Mimikyu could have been found in is the Safari Zone, and maybe in one of the routes near Saffron City, both as a reference to the doll that Sabrina had in an anime, and as another hint to Psychic type's weakness against Ghost, even though in Gen 1, Psychic type was actually immune to Ghost type, but you know. But now with Gen 1 covered, let's talk about how Mimikyu would have changed in Gen 2. Now first, there's the stats. Gen 2 introduced a split between a special attack stat and a special defense stat. This means that in Gen 2, the spread for Mimikyu's base stats would have changed to become what they are now. 55 for HP, 90 for attack, 80 for defense, 50 for special attack, 105 for special defense, and 96 for speed. Mimikyu in Gen 2 would still not have an ability and would still be a pure Ghost type, but at least its move pool would have improved. Shadow Ball, a Ghost type move with 80 base power, was introduced in Gen 2, and Mimikyu can learn it. Nowadays, Shadow Ball is a special move, which isn't good on Mimikyu even with stab, but remember that this was before the physical special split. This means that Mimikyu in Gen 2 would have used a much better attack stat. And now that the glitch that caused Psychic types to be immune to Ghost type attacks is fixed, Mimikyu in Gen 2 might have ended up being the Ghost type choice for many. And I'm not saying that because I like Mimikyu. I mean, your other two choices were the Gengar line and Mischievous. Speaking of Mimikyu being a good Ghost Pokemon to choose from, would Morty have used it? I'll be honest, I have no idea. I mean, Mischievous is a Gen 2 Ghost Pokemon, yet Morty, the Ghost Specialist of Johto, didn't use it. I mean, he probably could have used one, I guess. Finally, a good place for Mimikyu to be found in the Johto region is the Burn Tower. At this point in the game, a Pokemon with a base power of 476 isn't too bad, especially since the ace Pokemon of Morty and Whitney are already within that range anyways. Now we're at Generation 3, the Hoenn region, with the Gen 1 remakes also allowing trainers to use Gen 1 Mimikyu with updated mechanics. From this point on, Mimikyu's stats are going to stay the same. We're going to ignore any possible buffs Mimikyu could have received since we're talking about what if Mimikyu was in Gen 1 and what changes would be needed so that the Gen 1 Mimikyu could become the Mimikyu we all know and love today. Mimikyu would still be a pure ghost type, but would now have its signature ability, Disguise. When Disguise was first introduced, it would prevent Mimikyu from taking any damage whatsoever from the first attack. Hoenn's Ghost Specialist is Phoebe, and I do think that she could have used a Mimikyu. I think that Mimikyu fits with her team and her aesthetic really well. It could replace her first Dusclops, making the one she uses as her ace feel more special. Finally, I think that Mimikyu would fit in Mount Pyre. On to Generation 4, the Sinnoh region, and where I was introduced to the series. Before anything else, we need to quickly go over the physical special split. Starting in Generation 4 onwards, whether a move was physical or special was decided by the move itself and not the type it was. All ghost moves are physical before, but now moves like Shadow Ball, which was previously physical, was now special. Mimikyu is still a pure ghost type, and now has to use moves like the newly introduced Shadow Claw as its ghost type move of choice. Shadow Sneak would also be a move that Mimikyu would use since it's typically seen on competitive Mimikyus anyways. The ghost type specialist of Sinnoh is Fantina, but honestly I don't think Mimikyu fits her team very well. Here's the thing, I would have only given Mimikyu to Agatha and Morty since the games they were in had so few ghost types. But now, since a low roster of ghost types is no longer a problem, I now have more freedom to decide if Mimikyu is a fit for her team or not. In Phoebe's case, Mimikyu actually was a good fit, but not for Fantina. So I don't think I would give Fantina a Mimikyu. For Mimikyu's placement, of course the old Chateau is the obvious placement for Mimikyu, but that might be a bit too early in the game for Mimikyu's base stats, so maybe a higher Flora and Mount Coronet could also do better. Now we're on Generation 5, and here's where Mimikyu will change the least. Aside from some new moves, pretty much everything about Mimikyu will stay the same. So let's just go to the type specialist. The ghost specialist of Unova is Chantal, and maybe she could have used a Mimikyu, at least in the black and white sequels. Probably not in the base black and white since trainers only use Unova Pokemon in those games, but in black and white 2 I could see her using Mimikyu. Chantal uses the Banette and challenge mode of the black and white sequels, so maybe she could use a Mimikyu too. Now as for where Mimikyu would be found in the Unova region, in black and white could just be found in Black City or White City, along with all the other non-Gen 5 Pokemon. But in Black 2 and White 2, I think that Celestial Tower and the Strange House would work really well. Now finally, we have Gen 6. After this, our little Gen 1 Mimikyu would have gone through the same progress that I did when it was actually released in Gen 7. Even though Mimikyu's stats, ability, and move pool would have stayed the same, its typing would have changed. Gen 6 introduced the Fairy typing. As we know, Mimikyu is a Ghost Fairy type, so while before this Mimikyu would have been a pure Ghost type, with the move from the DS to the 3DS, Gen 1 Mimikyu would have been one of the older Pokemon that gained the Fairy typing, making it go from a pure Ghost type to a Ghost Fairy type. Now there's the Ghost type specialist. Except not. The Kalos region is the first and so far only region to not have any Ghost specialist. Not a Ghost type gym leader, nor a Ghost type Elite 4 member. There is, however, a Fairy type specialist, and remember, Mimikyu is now a Fairy type. Battery is the Fairy type gym leader of the Kalos region, and even though I don't think Mimikyu fits her aesthetic really well, neither does Mr. Mime, and Mimikyu would be a much better Pokemon for her to have than Mawile. So if we were to give Mimikyu to anyone in the Kalos region, I'd vote for Valerie. So now let's decide where in the Kalos region Mimikyu would be found in. One area that immediately jumped into my mind was Reflection Cave. I don't know why, but the idea of a Pokemon whose whole thing is that it wears a disguise to hide itself, living in a cave full of mirrors, is kind of funny to me. Some other good places would be Route 15 and Route 16, since they have an eerie look to them. With Gen 6 covered, we're done. Oras would be the same as the Gen 3 games, just with a physical special split, and then Sun and Moon is where Mimikyu was really introduced into the series. I had a lot of fun with this project and I hope you guys did too. I only went over what changes the Gen 1 Mimikyu we need to go through in order to become the Mimikyu we have now, but I'd love to hear what type of changes you would have made if you didn't stick with this rule set. I'd also like to see anyone else try this idea with their favorite Pokemon, especially if their favorite Pokemon is a mono Fairy type, like say Florges. Would a Gen 1 Florges have been a Grass type that gained the Fairy typing in Gen 6, or would it be changed from a Grass type to a Fairy type? Something like that would be interesting to think about. But anyways, this video is just about done, but I'll see you in the next one. Have a nice day.